In the spring of 1944, two German pilots flew over a quiet field in France. Below them sat an entire armoured division. Hundreds of tanks, artillery lined up for miles. They photographed it. They reported it up the chain of command. And the German army believed them. There was just one problem. That entire division could be folded up and carried away in the back of a few trucks. The tanks were made of rubber. The trucks were plywood. And the sound of 1,000 engines came from a phonograph record. This is the story of 1,100 men who fought the most dangerous battles of the Second World War and almost never fired a shot. Their weapon was the enemy's own imagination. This was the Ghost Army. To understand why an army would build a fake one, you have to understand the arithmetic of 1944. The Allies were pushing across France, but they were stretched thin. A front line is only as strong as the men standing on it, and there were never enough men to stand everywhere at once. Every time a division was pulled off the line to attack somewhere new, it left a gap, an empty stretch of road, a bridge with no one guarding it. And if German reconnaissance found that gap, they could pour an entire panzer corps straight through it and collapse the advance. Commanders had two ways to cover a gap. The first was to move real soldiers into it, but real soldiers were the one thing they never had to spare. The second was older than gunpowder itself. Make the enemy believe the gap was filled. Deception. Armies had always used tricks. Wooden cannons, campfires lit by men who weren't there. But in 1944, deception had a new problem to solve: the aeroplane and the radio. The enemy could now photograph your lines from 3 miles up and listen to your orders from 15 miles away. A few painted logs wouldn't survive a camera. So the US Army asked a strange question. If the enemy was going to look and listen, what if you gave them something to see and something to hear that was built entirely to be a lie? Not a single decoy. An entire counterfeit army, complete with sight, sound, and signal. In January 1944, that idea became a real unit, with a real number and orders to ship to Europe. On paper, it was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. In secret, it was something no army had ever fielded at this scale. A travelling illusion, 1,100 men strong. If you want to build a convincing fake, you don't recruit soldiers. You recruit people who make things look real for a living. So the army went hunting in places it had never recruited before: art schools, advertising agencies, design studios. The men who filled the ranks of the 23rd were painters, illustrators, set designers, architects, sound engineers, and radio operators. Some were pulled straight out of the Pratt Institute and the art programs of New York. They could paint a tank, fake a shoulder patch, mimic a radio operator's personal rhythm, and stage a scene, because staging scenes was what many of them had done in civilian life. Among them were men who would become famous after the war. Bill Blass, who would dress half of Hollywood, was a young sergeant sketching in his off hours. Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of America's great abstract painters, served in its ranks. The unit carried sketchbooks alongside its rifles, and some of the most striking watercolors of the European campaign were painted by men whose actual job was to deceive the enemy. But make no mistake, this was not a safe assignment for soft hands. These artists, trained as soldiers, drove into combat zones and operated within range of German guns. Their commanders understood something subtle: that a deception is a performance, and a performance needs artists who obsess over detail. The wrong tire track, the wrong insignia, a radio operator with the wrong accent in his Morse, any of it could give the whole show away and get them killed. They organized into 4 parts, like a theatre company with 4 departments. One handled the visual, the inflatable decoys and camouflage. One handled sound, one handled radio, and one handled the most human element of all, the atmosphere, the live performance of being an army that wasn't there. The most famous of their weapons you could hold in your two hands, and then watch it become a tank. They were inflatable decoys, full-size rubber dummies of Sherman tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, even aircraft. Flat, they could be folded and carried by a few men. Inflated, from a few hundred feet up, through the lens of a reconnaissance camera, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. A handful of soldiers could deploy an armoured battalion in a morning, but a fake tank that simply sits in a field is a postcard, not a threat. The genius was in making the lie behave like an army. The men studied how real units actually looked from above, and then they reproduced the mess. They cut fake tyre tracks into the mud with bulldozers, they lit cooking fires, they hung laundry, they left the careless, lived-in clutter that a camera expects to see around real soldiers. A perfectly neat decoy field would have screamed fake. A sloppy one whispered real. And they made it move. A division would advance overnight, men deflating the rubber army in one location and re-inflating it 10 miles forward by dawn. So German analysts tracking the photographs watched an armoured force march across the map under its own power. The force had never existed, but its progress was perfectly, convincingly logged. There were close calls that became legend. On at least one occasion, French civilians watched 4 soldiers casually pick up a 40-ton Sherman tank and turn it around by hand. The men, thinking fast, are said to have joked that clean living made American soldiers strong. The illusion had to be protected even from the people standing right next to it. The eye can be fooled by rubber. But an army is not only seen. At night, in the dark, it is heard. And the Ghost Army learned to counterfeit the sound of war itself. The work began at Bell Laboratories, where engineers recorded the real thing, tanks rolling, trucks grinding through gears, men shouting, pontoon bridges being hammered into place. They built a library of war on state-of-the-art vinyl records, each sound catalogued so it could be mixed and layered into a convincing scene. An armoured column here, an infantry company digging in there. Then they mounted enormous speakers, powered by amplifiers strong enough to be heard 15 miles away, onto half-tracks and trucks. At night, they would drive to the edge of the line and play the sound of an army assembling in the darkness. Engines, treads, the clank of construction. To a German listening post miles away, an armoured division was clearly massing in the woods ahead, preparing to attack at dawn. There was nothing there, just sound waves rolling across empty fields. But sound is a powerful witness. The enemy heard exactly what their fear expected to hear, and they aimed their defences at a roar. The sonic engineers were perfectionists. They knew weather changed how far sound carried, how it bent over hills and reflected off forests. A sound program had to be tuned to the terrain like a concert hall, or it would betray itself. They were, in the most literal sense, composing the music of an invasion that wasn't coming. The third weapon was invisible. It travelled through the air, and it was aimed at the enemy's ears in a different way, through the radio. By 1944, both sides listened constantly to each other's signals. You could learn an enormous amount from radio traffic without ever breaking the code, simply from who was talking, how much, and in what pattern. Every unit had a radio fingerprint, and every radio operator had a fist, a personal rhythm in the way he tapped out Morse, as individual as handwriting. The Ghost Army's operators became impersonators. They studied the fist of a real unit's operators and then became them on the air, sending the volume and the pattern of traffic that a whole headquarters would generate. When a real division went silent and slipped away to attack, The Ghost Army kept its radio voice alive on the old frequency. So to anyone listening, the division never left. Then there was the most human weapon of all, the act. The men called it atmosphere, and it was pure theatre performed for hidden spies. They would sew on the insignia of a famous division they were impersonating, paint its markings on their vehicles, and drive into a French town as if they owned it. In cafes and bars, soldiers would accidentally let slip details of a coming offensive, loudly, where they were sure German sympathizers would overhear. Generals' uniforms were worn by men who were not generals, saluted in public, photographed where it mattered. The whole unit was a stage set, and every man on it an actor playing a part, knowing that the wrong line said to the wrong person could unravel everything: sight, sound, signal, and performance. 4 illusions, layered so that whichever sense the enemy trusted, the lie was already waiting there to meet it. Here is what separates the Ghost Army from a clever magic trick. Their entire purpose was to be seen, to be heard, to make the most dangerous army in the world point its guns directly at them, and away from the real soldiers somewhere else. A real division can dig in, camouflage itself, and pray not to be noticed. The Ghost Army did the opposite. It stood up in the open and shouted, "Here we are! The main attack is coming from us." It was, deliberately, the most visible target on the battlefield. And it was almost defenseless. Their tanks would pop with a single bullet. Their artillery couldn't fire. If the Germans ever called the bluff, decided the noisy, obvious force in front of them was the real threat, and attacked it, 1,100 artists with rubber equipment would have stood in the path of a real offensive. They ran this risk again and again. Over the course of the war, the unit staged more than 20 separate deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, sometimes impersonating forces of up to 2 divisions, perhaps 30,000 men, with their 1,100. Each operation was a performance, with live ammunition in the audience. Their greatest performance came at the end, in March 1945, at the River Rhine, the last great natural wall guarding the heart of Germany. 2 real American divisions were preparing to cross. A river crossing is one of the most dangerous operations in war. Troops are horribly exposed on the water, and if the enemy concentrates against the crossing point, it becomes a slaughter. The job was to make sure the Germans concentrated somewhere else. So the Ghost Army staged a full crossing several miles downstream from the real one. Operation Viersen. They inflated their rubber armies. They ran their sound programs through the night, the roar of boats and bridging equipment massing at the false site. They flooded the airwaves with the radio traffic of 2 divisions preparing to attack. They even built fake artillery positions and ran real harassing fire to complete the picture. The Germans took the bait. They shifted attention and fire toward the Phantom Crossing. And when the real assault came, at the real place, the defense was looking the wrong way. The crossing succeeded. Historians estimate that across the whole war, the deceptions of this single small unit saved many thousands of lives. And then, having fought their way to the doorstep of Germany with rubber and sound, the Ghost Army simply disappeared from the story. When the war ended, the men were ordered to say nothing. The methods were considered too valuable, too likely to be used again, to ever be made public. So 1,100 soldiers went home and told no one what they had done. Not their families, not their friends. For decades, the Ghost Army did not officially exist. Many of them returned to the work they had left. Bill Blass built a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly's paintings hang in the world's great museums. They became art directors, illustrators, designers, shaping the look of post-war America, while the strangest chapter of their lives stayed locked in a classified file. The records were not declassified until 1996, more than 50 years later. By then, many of the men were gone, and most who remained had spent their whole lives unable to explain the war they had quietly helped win. In 2022, the surviving members, a tiny handful, by then in their late 90s, were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor the United States Congress can give. Nearly 80 years after they fought, the fake army was, at last, made real in the record. The Ghost Army proved something armies are tempted to forget in every generation. That war is not only a contest of steel and numbers. They won their battles with rubber, vinyl, paint, and nerve. They never held a line by force. They held it by conviction, by making the most powerful military on earth believe in soldiers who weren't there. Their most powerful weapon was never issued from an armory. It was the enemy's own imagination, turned into a weapon and pointed back at him. 1,100 men, almost no shots fired, thousands of lives saved, and a secret kept for half a century. If you want more of the strange, brilliant edges of warfare, the tricks, the forgotten weapons, the impossible victories the history books skip, subscribe. There are far more of these stories than you'd ever believe.